Welcome back. So we've met Jonathan Haidt on the first lecture, where he sort of introduced the main strain of theorizing these days about moral psychology. Uh, this essay is a much more lengthy, um, more complete account of his views. It's called The Emotional Dog and Its Rational Tail. This might be a slightly longer lecture than usual, but I will try to get through it in a reasonable time. So he starts with a story that may be familiar to you now. Haidt had used it several times, where he tells this story about a brother and sister that are adults and they decide to engage in sex with each other and they use protection and they apparently, he can build the story however he wants and he builds a story to say, hey, there was no harm really. That's his point, right? They enjoyed it. They made them feel fine. Nobody was scarred by it. There were no offsprings and on, right? Um, so he says, you can read the story yourself in the article, right? So he says, you tell people this story, right, or you have them read it in a study, and they usually say, you ask them, was what they did okay? And most people will say, no, it's wrong, right? Siblings should not engage in sex. And then if you ask people why, the first thing they usually say is something about, well, their kids could have birth defects. It's true, um, but according to the story, right, it stipulates they use birth control. They're aware of that and they prevented it. So when people are reminded of that, then they'll usually say something like, well, it's going to mess them up psychologically, right? It's just not good for you. But again, according to the story, maybe you think that the story is impossible or something, right? But anyways, the way he describes it, he says, nope, there was no emotional harm, right? They both said, that was nice. Maybe we're not going to do it again. And neither of it feels like hurt by it or anything, right? So you explain that to people and they still don't change their minds, right? They don't say, oh, okay, in that case, I guess it was fine if there was no harm, right? They say, well, I don't know why it's wrong. I can't explain it, but I know that it's still wrong, right? So this is the question that Haidt wants to sort of engage with is how can we know something is wrong without being able to provide any reasons for it, right? It seems to suggest that reason and rationality is not the whole story of moral. So he contrasts two views, which he calls rationalism and social intuitionism. So rationalism is the view that morality, moral judgments are rational judgments, and social intuitionism is his view, right? Where intuitions, again, are primary, and we'll get into the social part. So if you're a rationalist, right, about morality, this fact that people will insist that they know something is wrong without being able to give reasons for it is on the face of it, a problem for you as a rationalist, right? Rationalists claim that moral judgments are rational judgments, right? Like any of our other judgments we make about, what bus to take and what school to go to, and so on. When we make judgments about morality, same process, right? Same reasoning processes that we use. Um, Haidt says, well, right, that little scenario is a problem for rationalism because they have the judgment. They're very emphatic about the judgment, but they have no reasons, right? So he argues for a different model, which he calls the social intuitionist model. So intuitionism is sort of the view that moral judgment is kind of like perception, right? You just see that something is wrong, right? Um, it's also related to Hume's view that moral judgments are based in emotion, right? And Haidt is going to argue that yeah, you see someone kick a puppy, right? It just seems to instantly appear to you as wrong, right? You don't have to do a lot of reasoning, right? And he thinks that this judgment, this sort of instant judgment that seems to be based on perception, has a strong emotional component. So the social part is what happens afterwards. So when somebody asks you to justify your moral judgment, right? For example, when you say, yes, that's in that scenario, the brother and sister were wrong. Um, People will ask you, well, why is it wrong, right? And then you come up with reasons. So that's the social part. The social part is the rational part. So this is the emotional dog and its rational tail. So the dog is doing the work, right? The emotions are doing the work, and then the tail is sort of just epiphenomenal. Epiphenomenal means it does no real causal work, right? So it's not the other way around, right? Reason isn't in charge; the emotions are in charge. So a little bit more about rationalism, right? The view that he is challenging. So as early as Plato, who was, I don't know, 400 BC, something like that, Greek, and he wrote a dialogue called the Timaeus, which prioritizes reason, right, and takes a dim view of the emotions as kind of a necessary evil, right? It's something that we know humans have, but because they're not rational, uh, we typically want to say, well, you need to control those, right? And their reason is much better, and emotion is not to be trusted. Um, the job of emotions, it was thought, was as something to sort of get you off the fence and actually act, right? Which is still, we see Damasio's theory that's still there these days. Um, so emotion can definitely, right, get get you into action, uh, but dangerous if not governed by reason, was the traditional view. David Hume, again, sort of 17th century Scottish philosopher, was among the first ones to point out that emotion might have a bigger role in morality, right? Um, he thought that morality was not a rational enterprise and it was purely emotional reaction, right? And there's basically nothing more to it. So, according to Hume, when I say murder is wrong, what I'm really just saying is murder icky. Murder, thinking about murder makes me feel bad, right? He thought there's no rational basis for saying that murder is wrong. Reasoning, Hume thought, gives us information, but only emotion can add that normative dimension. Only emotion can say this is right or wrong, right? Reason just tells us what is, and emotion then tells us how to feel about it, what the valence is. It tells us what we care about, what we value, and then that gives us something to use reason for, right? So once my emotions tell me, um, I want this thing, I want to marry this person, I want this job, then we can use reason to get that thing. But reason alone is not going to tell us what to want. After Hume, we had Kant, and Kant was a rationalist, right? So he came up with a purely rationalistic ethics. Um, Categorical imperative was his sort of general moral rule, which was uh, there's a couple versions of it, but it was like never act unless, right, you could make the sort of rule behind that action totally universal. Sort of like don't do anything that you wouldn't want everyone to do all the time, right? A little more subtle than that because he thinks it's not would you want people to do it, but is it even logically possible for you to follow that rule all the time? But Kant was a huge name in moral philosophy, kind of dominated the scene and sort of eclipsed Hume for centuries. So back to rationalism. Now, again, this is moral psychology, right? This is not an ethics course. When psychologists study morality, they're not really interested in what is actually right and wrong. They're interested in how people make those judgments when someone says what's going on in their brain, right? And early psychologists like Freud saw a role for the irrational subconscious processes. Um, and this is a lightning fast survey of psychology, right? Of moral psychology. Uh, when you had behavioristic psychology, right, which didn't want to really talk about mental states, um, then reasoning was sort of taken off the table entirely, and they only wanted to talk about objective variables, stimulus and response. Um, so on that view, morality just is behavior that is rewarded by society and not much else. And then we get Kohlberg, who sort of establishes the sort of the beginnings of modern moral psychology. So Kohlberg studied moral development in children. He developed 6 stages of moral development, and the ultimate stage, right, the top stage, once they're fully developed, was like fully, totally rational, abstract moral reasoning. So he thought that children begin as egoists, kind of only responding to pain and pleasure. Just, they have desires, there's things they want, and they'll respond to rewards or punishment, but they don't think any more generally about right and wrong. Then they develop an ability to engage in trades with other people, right, and to respect those trades. Then they start to recognize that there's certain social roles that people have, and those roles have obligations, right? And you can fulfill those roles well or poorly, and so they start to become sensitive to those. And then finally, they learn general moral principles, maybe the categorical imperative, right? Something like that that can guide their action generally, right? So his method here in sort of discovering these different levels of moral development was to tell children of different ages stories about little moral dilemmas, ask them what should be done, and then he would record what they said and then sort of analyze their reasoning and say, okay, this person is stage one, this person is stage three. So one scenario that he used was about this man, Heinz. He says, oh, Heinz's wife is dying. She needs this drug, and Heinz can't afford it. It's very expensive. This pharmacist invented it and is charging a lot for it. The pharmacist won't cut a deal with Heinz to do a payment plan or something. Should Heinz steal the drug, right? Um, Things like that, right? So as far as emotion, Kohlberg, I mean, he agreed. Of course, it's there sometimes, right? We're emotional beings, right? So emotions will be present when we make moral decisions, but he doesn't think that it has any morally relevant role, right? So reason is the ultimate mechanism of judgment. And so post Kohlberg, right, rationalist views of moral judgments continue to dominate it. Um, One example is the social interactionist account of Nucci and Turiel. So similar methodology, right? They would interview children. In this case, they'd be describing rule violations and asking questions about, what is there a moral or non-moral basis of that violation? Rules, was there a reason for it? And they found that the difference between rules that are moral and rules that are merely convention in the minds of these kids, right? So sometimes, don't murder is a moral rule, but don't stand up on the bus is not necessarily a moral rule. It's more of a convention. Um, in the minds of the children, what makes something moral was that the violation could cause harm, injustice, or a violation of rights, right? Kind of seems like three separate moral foundations there in the minds of these kids. And if breaking the rule would cause someone harm or would cause an injustice or would cause a violation of rights, then it's a moral rule. And according to these kids, moral rules are universal, never be broken. So these studies do show that reasoning is often involved in moral judgments. Right? But the question is, for Haidt, is reasoning the cause of the judgment, or is the judgment and then the questions by the researcher the cause of the reasoning, right? So were the kids having a moral, right? So you tell the story, and the kid makes a judgment, right? And then you ask the kid, why did you say that that was immoral? Well, now they have to come up with reasons. So of course, right, if someone's asking them for reasons, they're gonna get reasons, right? But the question is, were the reasons the cause of the judgment, or was it something else, right? Was it this emotional intuitiousness? Um, right? Just like, does the belief that life begins at conception cause one to judge that abortion is immoral, or is the instinctive judgment that abortion is immoral cause one to then give reasons, right? That life begins at conception. These are open questions, right? But obviously, Haidt's going to say it's the intuition that comes first. So there's a lot. We've seen a fair amount of evidence for intuitionism at this point, right? So one is that story that he told, uh, right, about the incest scenario that is carefully constructed so that there's no possible harm, and we want to see if it still elicits a moral judgment, right? Again, was there harm? Was there injustice? Right? Was there a violation of rights? And if it wasn't, but these people still say that it's wrong, then obviously, like, those previous theorists missed something. Other examples are eating your dog after it's died of natural causes, cleaning your toilet with the American flag, uh, eating a piece of meat that someone has used for masturbation and then is cleaned and cooked or whatever. So all this stuff, and I apologize, right? He uses some gross and kind of weird sex stuff in these, but that stuff is things that people typically judge immoral, right? So these sorts of things, people typically say, no, that's wrong, right? And when you ask them why, they'll say, well, you could be harmed in some way, even though the scenarios are designed specifically to avoid any harm. Right? When you ask people about their emotional reactions to scenarios, usually an adverse emotional reaction is going to be a better predictor of whether they're going to say it's right, moral or immoral than whatever their claims about harm are. Right. So I mean, that's one way to figure out what the cause is. Right, is to see which is a better correlation, and it seems like that's the beginning of finding a cause, anyways. And it seems like negative emotional reactions correlate quite well with the moral judgments, more so than whatever reasons they give later, right? Um, so it seems like, at least, for these certain classes of moral judgments that have to do with uh, disgust, right, or purity violations, a lot of them, the intuitionist model seems to be superior to the rationalist one. It seems to predict people's judgments a lot more accurately. So, should we flip the history of psychology on its head, right? Should intuitionism replace rationalism altogether? Well, the basic claim of social intuitionism, right, is that moral judgment begins with a quick moral intuition, right, a system one judgment. And then when we need reasons, and we don't always need reasons because we don't always have someone questioning us, but when we do, we come up with reasons, but they're post hoc and they typically tend to support the initial intuition. So let's define our terms a little bit more rigorously. So we've been talking about moral judgments a lot. If you're trying to define moral judgment, uh, coming up with necessary and sufficient conditions, right, that captures all the moral judgments and only the moral judgments, and distinguishes it from other kinds of normative judgments about aesthetics or skill or whatever, is going to be very hard, right? And this actually ends up being true of everything, right? Apart from bachelors being unmarried men, and what even numbers being numbers divisible by two, right? There's a few necessary and sufficient definitions you can make for things, but those tend to be the minority, right? Try defining the word chair. Um, it's actually really hard to find something that captures all the chairs and only the chairs. So it's not too surprising that that would be the case with moral judgment. So he does his best, right? Which is, moral judgments are a class of judgments in a given culture regarding virtues or goods that are universal in that culture, or for some class of people in that culture. When we say class of people, there might be moral rules that apply to women but not to men, and so on. Right? So hey, the definition might be a little fuzzy, right? So it seems to entail that if you had a culture that is really health obsessed, then eating a low fat diet might qualify as a moral uh, thing, right? Because again, it's a good, right? Being healthy is good. And if it's totally universal in that culture that everybody really cares about it, then it would seem to turn out moral. Um, there might be debate on that. But anyways, that's his first stab at a definition, and it's as good as any, I suppose. So Haidt is modeling moral reasoning on scientific reasoning, which is generation of a hypothesis followed by testing and revision of that hypothesis in the now. Some of this reasoning that goes on may be unconscious. It might be subject to various biases, right? Our brains are sort of evolved to do as to make us survive long enough to have kids, right? They didn't evolve necessarily to be absolutely rigorously truth-seeking, right? So we have certain biases for sure. But at any rate, it is a multi-step process, and at least part of it is going to be conscious. Right? Then moral reasoning for him will be taking information about people, forming a moral judgment through a multi-step conscious process. Right? So what makes this reasoning and not intuition is that it's got numerous steps and it's conscious, right? So again, if I'm trying to judge, well, what's the best charity, right, to give my money to, and this is a moral question, and then the steps might be, well, I'd like to give uh, money to a charity that does the most good with my money, and then I'm going to survey the various charities and calculate which one does the most good with my money, and so on. So there's going to be multiple steps. There'll be consciousness involved, right? So that is moral reasoning as opposed to moral intuition. How do we define moral intuition? Uh, so when they enter our consciousness, at least, Intuitions seem to appear just all at once without really any effort. Not a multi-step process, at least at the conscious level. It's hard to say what's going on at the subconscious level. Right? Intuition is not synonymous with emotion, although they are related. Right? Rather, what he wants to say is you've got cognition, right? And intuition and reason are two kinds of cognition. Right? Intuition is the automatic kind. It seems to be a single step process, or at least we don't have conscious access to the steps if there are multiple steps, right? And reasoning is, again, conscious, multiple steps. So moral intuition is the sudden appearance in consciousness of a moral judgment, including an affective valence, right? So there is an emotional, affective level part to it, and without any awareness of having gone through any steps of deliberation, right? It just appears to you as like, that's bad, and I don't like it, right? So in this way, so intuition is sort of similar to perception in this, very immediate, right? So when I'm perceiving, I'm given to me, right? And it's similar in moral intuition, right? I see an event and immediately a judgment. So here is his model. He's got it sort of drawn out in a, usually called this a boxology because there'll be boxes, but he's gone with circles instead of boxes. It's a functional diagram of the process of forming a moral judgment, right? So we have some situation right up in the upper left corner, an eliciting situation, a man kicking a puppy, right? Whatever, a scenario of the brother and sister, something like that. So there's an arrow that goes right to an intuition, right? Um, so an intuition sort of just appears. Again, there may be a lot going on subconsciously, but at the conscious level, it seems to just appear to us. And then intuition leads to a judgment. So that is link number one there, what he calls the intuitive judgment link. So this happens automatically and immediately. See the man kicking the puppy, our gut says that's wrong, and I judge it and I say that's a bad guy, he did the wrong thing, right? Now the next arrow out, right, is into reasoning. So we've had the intuition, we've had the judgment. Now number two is the post hoc reasoning link. So if somebody asks you, your reasons for that judgment, you can give them, right? But it only happens after the judgment has been made on the basis of intuition, according to Haidt. Again, this is the model. We've seen some evidence for the model. He's going to give us more, right? Right now, he's just laying out the model according to him of this is how moral judgments happen. Haidt says, right? You may or may not agree with him. Okay, so we've gone from intuition to the judgment, from the judgment to reasoning, and now number three, right, is from reasoning to someone else's intuition, right? B from A, so this is person A. Now person A talks to person B, right, and convinces them that your judgment is correct. Now this link, he claims, is rarely successful because reasoning is not the basis of most moral judgments, right? Most people will make judgments on the basis of their own intuition. So you can give someone reasons all day long, and most of the time, it's not going to make a difference. There's also a link that doesn't go via the reasoning bubble. It goes straight from A's judgment to B's intuition, right? So this is number four, the social persuasion link, right? And this one is more effective on people than number three. The mere fact that you have made a judgment and are another human being will tend to influence people, right? Sort of subconsciously or at the intuitive level, right? If everybody's saying, "Ooh, that's so wrong," I'm going to kind of go along with the crowd. That's actually more influential on me than whatever reasons they might give, right? Just the very fact that everyone has agreed that it's wrong, right? So reasoning can play a role in moral judgments when it comes from other people, but the effectiveness is limited. But you can change your own mind, right? So this is back to the top there with A, and we see link 5 there, which is the reasoned judgment link. So that is just when, right, you come up with reasons and your reasonings actually, the reasoning actually causes you to want to change your judgment. That can happen. It's not impossible, right? Nothing we never reason or we never change each other's minds or our own minds on the basis of reason. So that's number 5. It happens. He doesn't deny it. There is also number 6, the private reflection link. So while you're reasoning about a moral situation, about a judgment you've already made, that may spark a new intuition, right? You may be thinking about stuff, another image will pop into your mind that will cause you to have another intuition, another emotional reaction, right? Maybe you're putting yourself in someone else's shoes, trying to think how they would feel in that situation and so on. And that may cause you to have a different intuition that could then cause you to have a different. That's the number 6 link all the way back to intuition. Um, so according to the rationalists, all moral judgments are just links 5 and 6. And the social intuitionist model sees them as two things that can happen, right? But in a much larger model of a lot more going on, right? Okay, so problems with rationalism, right? So dual process. We've talked about dual process theory, right? This is the view associated with Kahneman and Tversky, and then it's been very popular. I mean, the Nobel Prize has been won for this stuff. That we've got basically two parallel systems, decision-making systems in our brain. System 1, unconscious and affective, emotional. System 2, conscious and rational. So rationalist moral psychology, right, is all system 2. Right? They don't offer any role for system 1, right? They don't offer the possibility that some moral judgments are system 1 judgments. Now, according to dual process theory, system 1 is an older system, right? It's by phylogenetically older, we mean like, our evolutionary ancestors probably had system 1, chimps and even earlier than chimps, earlier mammals, right? Um, so if morality was a process that evolved, right, throughout history, it was probably first a system 1 process, right? And that system 1 process is probably still preserved in humans. So if chimps made most of their moral judgments, if you can attribute morality to chimps, it was probably system 1 process for them. We still have that same system 1 process, and we also now on top of that have the system 2, right? We have seen that evidence shows that affective cues, right? If you pay attention to someone's emotion or prime or manipulate their emotions, it's going to be much more predictive of their moral judgments than the reason, whatever reasoning. Okay, so some more sort of evidence or support for the social intuitionist model, polarization. So the social intuitionist model predicts that discussion with others can change your mind, right? And that was that whole bottom person B, right? We didn't finish that. Maybe we'll go back to it, but if you follow that all the way back, you can see that you can talk to someone, person B, and you can change their mind either by giving them reasons or just by making the judgment, being another human and sort of peer pressure. But eventually, if that person talks back to you, they might change your mind. And so this is a social loop, right? Um, but Haidt's claim is in that whole process, affective factors, right? System 1 factors are much actually more effective than reasons are. And if you believe that, it predicts things like belief polarization, where talking with someone you dislike or someone you disagree with does not actually bring them to their point of view. It doesn't bring each other closer. It actually tends to drive people farther into their own corners, right? Why is that? Because of the affective dimension. So if you're on either side of of the road with your signs, and one person saying right pro-choice, the other person is screaming pro-life, um, nobody's convincing each other or like bringing each other in the middle, right? You're both having these emotional reactions about how terrible the other people are, and it's driving you apart, right? Because the affective dimension is the important part. But this also predicts that if you are having a discussion with someone you actually like, right, um, they will have a better chance of convincing you of their position, and they can do it actually quite easily, right? And this has been shown in the lab. And again, this is because the affective dimension is doing all the work, right? So you can get people to do reasoning. Again, it exists. It's a thing that happens. Uh, it's typically most effective when it's a total stranger with whom you have no real emotional reaction whatsoever, right? It's not someone you particularly like, particularly dislike. When the emotions are gone, that leaves some room for the slightly weaker less powerful reasoning process to affect, right? That's how you get, right, reasoning to work on other people, is you have to take emotions out of it entirely. Other problems with rationalism. So there's two forces that can cause us to reason toward a prescribed conclusion, uh, rather than doing the reasoning and deciding what conclusion follows from that. Um, this is called motivated reasoning, right? We've already decided what the conclusion is going to be, and we're just trying to give reasons, right? Instead of trying to decide whether the conclusion is actually true. Uh, so one thing is the relatedness motive, right? So as a social species, we need to get along with others. We can't really survive without others. That produces peer pressure, right? There's a pressure to agree with others. So if someone else makes a judgment, your default is just going to be to agree with them, and then you're going to want to provide reasons that support that agreement. Typically, there's not much reasoning involved. If someone else has made a moral judgment first, your instinct is going to be, yeah, I'm going to go along to get along. Somebody asks me for reasons, I can come up with some reasons, right, that agree with that judgment, but the judgment is not the reasons at all. Second is a coherence motive. So again, once we've made a judgment on the basis of intuition, any information that contradicts that judgment can cause what they call cognitive dissonance, right? We don't like to hold contradictory information in our brains, or contradictory beliefs at the same time. Uh, so what that often causes us to do is to simply sort of ignore uh, inconvenient information, right, that doesn't agree with our judgments that we already made, and we'll come up with reasons that will support it, right? Whether or not those reasons are true, right? Um, how this usually happens is if you hear evidence in favor of your view, you just accept it uncritically. And if you hear something that contradicts your view, you're going to question it and not want to believe it until you see, right, more support. And you do notice people doing that all the time on social media and Facebook. Right? See something that you already agree with, and you're like, yeah, it's probably true, right? And if it's something you don't agree with, you say, well, what, you know. So these two mechanisms of motivated reasoning, right? The one where you just kind of go along with other people, and the other one where you just want to keep coherence. You want to avoid cognitive dissonance by avoiding, right, inconvenient information. Uh, they're also aided by the fact that humans are typically not great at recognizing and weighing evidence, right? So, uh, if you've studied probability theory, right, and Bayesian reasoning decision theory, uh, there are like rigorous methods for sort of weighing, right, evidence and coming up, revising your hypotheses, and humans kind of rarely follow those. Uh, if someone asks you for evidence for your view, I mean, a lot of time what they'll do is just give you an anecdote, right? Um, so if somebody says, people say, or I'm a philosopher, people say, oh, it must be hard to find a job as a philosopher. And if I say, oh, well, now my friend got a good job, right? Okay, well, that's one person, right? That's not evidence, right? The question was, is statistically, but people do that kind of reasoning all the time. If you ever are used to talking to humans, it should sound familiar, right? Um, and then so if people were throwing out anecdotes, well, it is just an anecdote, so I can ignore it if it conflicts with my view, right? And then if it appears to support my view, I'll treat it as a little more than an anecdote, right? We seem to reason better when the conclusion doesn't actually matter to us at all. So in studies, right, uh, if they ask you, uh, do you think that the person you're about to meet is an extrovert? Uh, People will actually do pretty good reasoning, right? Because it doesn't matter to them whether that person is an extrovert. Whereas if you ask people, give them the conclusion the death penalty does not deter murder, people are going to tend to already have opinions about the death penalty, right? And so they're going to tend to reason badly when it actually matters, right? It's kind of the opposite of what you would think, but that's how brains tend to work. So the post hoc problem. So in the 70s, Nisbet and Wilson did a bunch of great experiments on this stuff. They showed that we have really relatively little insight into our own decision-making processes. So one famous one is they would place sort of a bunch of scarves on a rack, or identical scarves on a rack, ask people to choose one. Um, people will just tend to take the last item on a rack. That's just do statistically. So that's what most people did, right? And they ask them, "Oh, why did you choose that one?" They'll say something, right? They'll say, "Oh, the color was a little, it was a more purpley, and I liked it," or this one, the fabric seemed a little nice, or whatever. They never say, "Oh, it was the last one on the rack," right? They made up false post hoc reasoning, right? And we do this in all sorts of areas, right? Um, it also shows up in studies of split brain patients. So um, people with severe epilepsy, I don't think they really do this anymore, but for a while they would cut the corpus callosum, which is connects your left and right hemispheres, and it does seem to reduce the severity of the seizures, but it also, and it generally, people seem to be relatively okay after you cut their brain in half, which is sort of surprising. But if you get a little more clever and test them on stuff, there's some really surprising stuff that happens, and it really does seem to be the case that the two hemispheres are not talking to each other whatsoever, right? So you can give the information to sort of one hand, right? If you kind of like distract their attention or don't allow, one side of their visual field to just block or something, right? So you can kind of just talk to one side of the brain, and then uh, if you ask like the verbal side of their brain, what just happened, they'll make up a story about it, right? It's interesting stuff, right? The point being, yeah, people make up reasons all the time, and they actually have relatively little insight, or so they claim, into what's really going on in their brain in some cases. So, if Haidt is right, that moral judgments are initially based on unconscious automatic system one processes, then we're not going to have conscious access to the real reasons for our moral judgments, and the real reasons are our intuitions. So when somebody asks you to explain your judgment, um, we're not going to know, right? But we still want to say something for some reason. Humans don't want to say, "I don't know, I just made the judgment." So we use what Nisbet and Wilson call a priori causal theories. That is, we think about why other people might make certain judgments, and we just use those reasons, right? So we just come up with a theory of like what humans do and how humans think, and we say, that's probably what I did, right? Um, so after all this, we go back to Kohlberg, right, and his studies of children, right, and he gives them, again, he gives children the Heinz scenario: should Heinz have steal the drug to save his wife? And the kids give some answer, right? And he says, "Oh, well, that kid's answer says that they're at a higher stage." Um, Now, in the light of all this evidence, uh, that reasoning that the child gave probably has nothing to do with the actual reason for their judgment, right? Their initial judgment was just a intuition, right? So, and this is actually supported, right? So even children at stage one who are supposedly only uh, sensitive to like pain and pleasure, and they're basically just little egoists. Well, if you ask them questions, they will say that hitting is wrong because you'll get punished, right? Um, and but they will judge hitting that goes unpunished as wrong, right? So they are sensitive to the reasons that people out there give, even if they themselves don't have that level of reasoning yet when they're making their own judgments. So this sort of predicts that, moral disputes like the abortion debate is just a handy one that keeps coming up, I keep using, right? Why they're so hard to resolve and why they cause such bitterness. So both pro-life and pro-choice activists think that their moral judgments are based on reasons, right? And so they think that the other side is being unreasonable and just stupid or um, ill-intentioned, right? Or lying or something like that. When in fact, both sides have based their judgments on sort of unconscious processes. All the reasons they're giving are actually post hoc, right? So neither one of them are actually behaving initially based on reasons, right? But they think that the other one is, and so they think that the other person is being unreasonable or not genuine or something like that. And it also shows that arguing with each other, giving you my reasons, giving you your reasons, is probably not going to change anything, since the reasons were never the source of the judgment in the first place. And I mean, on the surface, yeah, it's kind of, even the slogans are sort of like talking past each other, right? One is saying uh, fetuses are human beings. The other is saying women have the right to choose. Those are both consistent, right? Those are not opposing views. Um, the one is not trying to refute the other's claims at all, right? They're talking past each other. Okay, so does moral reasoning ever cause behavior? So there definitely is a statistical correlation between better moral reasoning and better behavior. So it would be crazy to say that reasoning does nothing, right? Um, but he thinks that that correlation may not actually be causal, right? So um, one confounding variable is IQ. So does being smarter cause you to act morally? Criminals do tend to have lower IQs on average, pardon me, but it may not be that simple. So dual process theorists argue that the phenomenon is better explained as a competition between the quick emotional system one thinking and the cool rational system two thinking. So if I don't know if you've heard about the marshmallow test. Right? So you, a young child, like a 3-year-old, 4-year-old, you put a marshmallow on the table and you say, if you can wait 5 minutes or however long, I'll give you 2 marshmallows, or you can eat it right now. It's up to you. And some kids, they just can't resist and they gobble the marshmallow. Some kids can wait to get 2 marshmallows, right? And they show correlations with better, surprisingly different later life outcomes for kids that can wait, right? And delay gratification for something better later. Fairly intuitive how that might serve you later in life, right? If you can just sort of like do the right thing slowly and save your money and all that stuff, you'll have better outcomes. Right? Are the children that pass the marshmallow test smarter? Well, not necessarily, right? Maybe their system two is a little bit stronger, right? They have better system two control over their system one impulses. It's a kind of skill, it's a very useful skill, um, but it's not the same thing as IQ. Um, More evidence of sort of association between morality and reasoning comes from psychopaths, and we've seen this before, right? They have normal reasoning abilities, but they lack the normal emotional reactions, right? So uh, they know at the rational level that certain actions are immoral, or at the very least know that they're forbidden, right? They may not, without the proper emotions, you might argue they can't really understand morality, right? But they know that, killing is frowned upon, right? And they'll get locked up. Uh, they lack the affective dimension that makes them care, right? So they will often commit immoral acts. We seem to have found probably where the deficit is. It's in ventromedial prefrontal cortex. Um, People with this damage to this area don't show really any emotional reaction to pictures of mutilated people and so on, right? So, and we saw back in lecture one, or in the lecture on mind perception, right? It seems to be an inability to see people as other beings as suffering patients, right? Um, and so point being, you can be perfectly rational and be profoundly morally impaired, right? And what appears to be impaired is your emotions, not your reason. So emotion and empathy do seem to be a necessary condition for normal moral judgment, normal moral action. Um, a psychopath can certainly learn to be moral by following the rules. They do it all the time. The vast majority of people that would maybe qualify as psychopaths uh, are not serial killers, right? They know how to get by in the world. Um, but they seem to just lack this certain emotional reaction, right? Um, Empathy has been shown to be a causal factor in altruistic action. Subjects who, for example, experience empathy when watching someone get shocked, and all these shock experiments, they're like it's one of the researchers pretending to get shocked, so nobody's actually getting harmed, right? But they'll get subjects in that don't know, and they'll see somebody getting shocked supposedly for the purposes of the experiment, and then some subjects will be more empathetic than others, right? And the ones that are shown to be more empathetic are also more likely to volunteer to take the place, right, of the person getting shocked. It's okay, you can shock me, right? They'll even sometimes choose to be shocked rather than given the option to simply leave the room and stop having to see the person getting shocked, right? So it does seem that like empathy and this ability to have an emotional reaction to suffering um, makes you more altruistic. All right, so where are we? Ooh, 45 minutes. We're on the last few slides here. what are the mechanisms of intuition? So uh, there's an account of the emotions that's associated with William James called the James-Lange theory of emotion. Antonio Damasio, who we've talked about, is sort of latched onto it. Jesse Prince, more recently, a philosopher, has latched onto it. And the idea is that emotions don't begin primarily in the brain or as a cognitive sort of thing, but in the body. So William James says to be angry just is to have tensed muscles in the face, right? So it's not like you get angry and then your face gets tense, but being tense is the anger, right? Um, and Damasio claims that these sorts of bodily experiences are crucial for making decisions and forming judgments. So in the lab, you can manipulate people's judgments by manipulating their bodily experiences, right? So if you, right, make them feel tense or hot, they will act more angry, right? Um, Purity judgments we've seen begin as a feeling of disgust, right? And which probably innate bodily reaction to protect us from spoiled or poisonous food, right? And um, we talked a lot about purity judgments in moral foundations theory, right? Is that other foundation that's an emotional reaction, disgust. So according to the rationalist model, morality is learned, right? And according to the social intuitionist model, a lot of morality is probably innate, although of course it could be shaped by culture. And we've talked about moral nativism, right? Some of the evidence for moral nativism comes from studies of other primates besides humans, like chimps. Um, Chimps do seem to have some kinds of morality, right, around rules around mating, care for infants, other sorts of social interactions, and they do punish each other for violating those norms. Um, Fisk has noted sort of three general norms that humans appear to share with other primates, which are communal sharing, authority ranking, and equality matching, which means sort of repaying favors and also repaying insults. So chimps seem to do that, humans seem to do that too. Humans have more developed morality. We seem to have this fourth norm that chimps don't have, which is market pricing, so that it's a little bit more advanced form of equality matching where you're not just repaying favors, but you're calculating them sort of more precisely and over a longer time period. Um, and then humans also agree to sort of third party enforcement of these norms, right? We hire people and pay police to run around enforcing moral norms. Uh, but a lot of overlap between the humans and the chimps. Okay. So if morality is largely innate, then it's not so much the case that we learn the moral rules, right, by watching people and learning and then internalizing them. Rather, we take our internal intuitions and then externalize them into moral rules. And Fisk argues that the four basic norms emerge in child development. So communal sharing in infancy, authority ranking by age 3, equality matching by age 4, and then market pricing in like middle, late childhood. And this is sort of ontogenetic, which is like in the development of a single right being. This is your ontogeny, and that ontogenetic sequence matches the phylogenetic sequence in evolution, right? So support for this claim that the sequence is one of having internal intuitions that are externalized into rules rather than the other way around um, comes from sort of the sudden appearance of these new forms of moral behavior as these innate mechanisms come online. So it's not a gradual process of like picking up on the data and then slowly learning. It's like something innate kicks in and all of a sudden new forms of moral behavior fairly suddenly, right? So before age 4, children don't seem to care much about fairness, even though in those 4 years you have adults and older children talking about fairness all the time, right? But until the age 4, they don't seem to care. And all of a sudden, boom, it kicks in. And then all of a sudden, they're obsessed with fairness, like almost too much, right? So that seems, or, Fisk claims to be indicative of an innate mechanism coming online rather than you learning something uh, from socialization. So even if morality is innate, it obviously differs in culture and is shaped by culture, right? Um, So one way this might happen is if we're actually born with a very wide range of intuitions, but only a small subset of those will be encouraged in a given culture. Um, that does seem to be the case. We've seen already that sort of in some Eastern cultures, in India, purity violations seem to be more important than in many Western cultures and so on. Um, Schwader identifies three clusters of moral intuitions that cultures tend to adopt. He calls them autonomy, community, and divinity. Uh, so a culture that promotes the autonomy cluster of moral intuition care more about rights, freedoms, personal welfare. Sounds a lot like Western cultures, definitely the US, right? Um, and then intuitions that are not nurtured will go away. So if divinity, right, is not particularly nurtured in our culture, then we're not going to care so much about that. Right? Just like a newborn child is born with the ability to learn any language. It can learn Mandarin, it can learn English, it can learn Italian, but then beyond a certain age, if you get locked into the English or whatever, and then your ability to learn Mandarin is much lower, right? So similar with morality, right? You're born with a broader palette, but then your culture will sort of like lock you into a certain subset of those. Okay, so back to our model, right? Here's his boxology of circles, right? Um, so the social intuitionist model does leave a role for reason in the moral judgments. It's just not the primary role. It's a subset of the larger picture. And again, this is captured by the links in the model. So by interacting with others, right, when we go down to B, right, and we hear their reasons, right, we can change our minds, but it's typically by sparking a new intuition. You can have your mind changed by reasons, but it's much easier to have your mind changed by listening to somebody, and all of a sudden you hear from a different perspective. You're able to put yourself in someone else's shoes, right? You An image comes to you that's particularly emotionally salient, right? And all of a sudden now you've got a new moral intuition and your mind has changed. So it can happen through interaction with other people. And it can also happen purely through reasoning, but it's just more rare. All right, last slide. Thanks for sticking around. We'll get in under an hour at least. Um, So, Haidt's social intuitionist model is based on some empirical evidence, uh, but the best test of a theory is if it makes bold, new predictions, right, that haven't been tested and that turn out to be true. So he offers a few of these, right? So number one, interference. He says, look, if moral judgment and reasoning are separate processes, then interfering with your reasoning should not affect your moral judgment. And so you could think of all sorts of studies where you ask somebody to make a moral decision, and then you also try to make them do a math problem at the same time or something. And if Haidt is right, that shouldn't have any effect on their ability to make a moral judgment. Number two, ecological variation. So in lab studies, the conditions are pretty artificial, right? And they're so artificial sometimes that it's hard to pry apart intuition and reason, right? Because it's hard to get emotionally involved in scenarios that somebody's reading to you. Uh, so more ecologically valid studies, which is sort of studies that simulate real life a little bit more, right? He thinks those ought to reveal the post hoc nature of moral reasoning more clearly. He thinks that if we can get more realistic studies, it'll be even more obvious that his social intuitionist model is correct. And then three, consilience. So in general, he thinks if social intuitionism is correct, then it should start to line up with the other theories and other disciplines. Moral psychology is an interdisciplinary uh, um, enterprise, right? And as theories start to develop in the other areas that are all linked, he thinks, if they all start to line up and it looks like social intuitionism really like fits in with those, then that's going to be good evidence as well. Again, that's to be seen in the future. All right, thanks for sticking it out with me, and that'll be it for now, and I'll see you next time.